She invited him to our Valentine's dinner. She told me he was joining us just because he needed support. I sat there, silent, as they flirted openly, each laugh a knife in my chest. Hours later, my life had completely changed. What I did next shocked everyone, including her. I woke up that February morning in San Diego feeling a mix of anticipation and calm focus. The apartment was quiet, the light through the blinds pale and steady, and I went about my routine with deliberate precision. I pressed my shirt until the creases disappeared, polished my shoes until they reflected the floor, and checked my watch and car to make sure everything was in order. Each action was methodical, a rehearsal for the evening I had been planning for weeks. I laid out the envelope with the reservation confirmation, glanced at the small bouquet of flowers I had bought, and tried to ignore the fluttering tension in my chest. Emily appeared in the bedroom doorway later, her hair meticulously styled, her makeup flawless, and a green dress I had never seen before clinging perfectly to her frame. My initial relief at her beauty was immediately punctuated by the announcement she had prepared. She had invited her coworker, Michael, to join us for the dinner. She said it was because he had been going through a difficult time. The words landed somewhere between absurd and sharp. I felt a tightening in my stomach, a heat rising behind my eyes. I wanted to protest, to insist it was only supposed to be us, but I felt the familiar hesitation, the pressure to not appear jealous or controlling, and I said nothing aloud. I nodded, gathered my composure, and prepared to go along, silently cataloging the unease that had begun to take root. The drive to the restaurant was quiet. The streets glinted under the pale winter light, the ocean breeze cold against the windshield. My mind replayed the scenario, imagining how awkward it might be, trying to brace myself for every possible interaction. When we arrived, the darkness of the evening seemed to press in. The city lights muted against the fog rolling off the bay. Michael was already seated at the table, his posture confident, his suit sharp, his watch glinting under the restaurant lighting. I recognized the subtle cues of dominance and ease, the way he extended his hand in a firm grip. I took my seat opposite Emily and Michael, and immediately felt the shift in energy. They leaned toward each other, their conversation flowing effortlessly, filled with inside jokes, work stories, and shared experiences I had never been part of. They laughed together, their heads tilting slightly, the motion of comfort and familiarity isolating me further. I picked at my meal, the texture and taste almost irrelevant, as I observed the choreography between them, each gesture and glance highlighting my own exclusion. I noticed the way Michael reached for Emily's hand briefly while talking, how she tilted her head in response, and the way they shared bites of their food. Each detail etched itself into my memory with sharp clarity, the slow burn of humiliation spreading, tempered by the strict control I imposed on myself. I stayed silent, internalizing everything, recording the scene like evidence in my mind. My pulse raced, yet I forced a steady outward calm. I cataloged their laughter, the casual brush of their hands, the way the waiter placed the food in front of us without acknowledging my presence. I noted the angles of the chairs, the spacing at the table, even the subtle changes in Emily's posture when she caught my eye. The whole evening seemed surreal, yet the sensations were concrete: exclusion, disbelief, and a creeping sense of betrayal. I did not speak. I did not react beyond the careful maintenance of my composure. I simply observed, keeping control over my body and mind, while the reality of the situation unfolded in front of me. Time moved slowly, marked by the clinking of cutlery and the soft murmur of other diners. I finished my meal in silence, the taste a faint background to the sharper sensations of isolation. Every laugh between Emily and Michael, every shared glance, every small touch reinforced my role as an outsider, and I cataloged it all meticulously. By the end of the meal, the weight of it had settled into a firm, unyielding knot in my chest. I felt the humiliation, the sting of being invisible, but also a quiet, simmering clarity. This was my reality, and I would navigate it with deliberate precision, keeping every observation and feeling as clear and controlled as the steps I had taken that morning. The check arrived with a quiet inevitability, sliding across the table like a verdict I had already anticipated. I looked at the total, the numbers stark under the soft glow of the restaurant lights, and made a deliberate choice. I reached into my wallet, withdrew the exact amount for my meal and tip, and placed it carefully on the edge of the table. I did not linger, did not offer excuses or explanations. I stood, feeling the slight scrape of my chair against the floor, the eyes of Emily and Michael on me, registering their surprise and confusion. Neither of them spoke, neither of them moved to acknowledge what I had done. Their indifference, combined with their shock, carved a clarity through the haze of humiliation I had carried for hours. I walked out of the restaurant with a steady pace, the cool evening air pressing against my face. The streets were quiet, the headlights reflecting off the damp pavement from an earlier drizzle. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, my mind a disciplined observer of my own reactions. Anger and relief mingled in my chest, a dual pulse of betrayal and liberation. I did not speak aloud, did not curse or vent. I allowed myself only to feel the subtle tightening and loosening within my body, registering the shift in control that had begun the moment I had risen from the table. At my apartment, I moved with methodical precision. I opened drawers, sorted my clothes, organized documents and personal items, selecting only what I would carry with me for the night. Each motion was deliberate, a small exercise in reclaiming agency. I packed my laptop, books, toiletries, and the minimal clothing I would need, folding and arranging with the exactness of a ritual. My apartment, once shared and familiar, now became a staging ground for autonomy. I left everything else, leaving no trace of my presence beyond the essentials I had chosen to take. I called my friend, who lived nearby with a spare room, and arranged to stay there. I moved quietly through the city streets, the weight of my bag firm on my shoulder, observing the subtle details of the night, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional passing pedestrian, the reflection of neon signs in puddles. Each observation grounded me, reminded me that the world was larger than the moment, that life would continue beyond the insult I had endured. I blocked Emily's number, social media accounts, and any method of direct contact. The action itself was simple, almost mechanical, but it created a space around me that was mine alone. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to sit, to breathe, and to catalog the facts without embellishment. I wrote them down mentally, step by step, the sequence of events, the details of gestures, the timings, the nuances of body language. I observed without judgment, without outrage, without the need for revenge. The clarity was intoxicating. In those first hours alone, I realized the importance of boundaries. I traced each step I had taken, acknowledging the deliberate choice to leave, to reclaim myself, to disengage. I reviewed the scene in my mind, noting the emotions and sensations as data points rather than as triggers. Every detail reinforced the single, undeniable fact: my autonomy, my self-respect, and my control over my life could not be negotiated, compromised, or stolen. I had acted decisively, and in that act, I had begun to reshape the terms of my existence. The night stretched on, silent except for the rhythm of my own breathing, and I allowed myself a measure of calm. The decision had been made, the boundary drawn, and for the first time, I felt the tangible weight of clarity settle into my chest. It was the third day after the restaurant incident when Emily appeared at the office. I was at my desk when I noticed her through the glass doors of the lobby, her movements purposeful, her expression tight with determination. I stood at the threshold, measuring the distance between us, refusing to allow her inside. I maintained a calm exterior while my mind cataloged every detail. The color of her coat, the tension in her shoulders, the urgency in her steps. I did not flinch or react beyond holding the line, preserving the boundary I had established. Word of the evening had already begun to ripple through the network of colleagues and mutual acquaintances. Casual questions, whispered comments, and subtle glances marked the spread of information. Each inquiry and remark was noted and filed in my mind, a record of the social pressure mounting around me. I observed without responding, analyzing the patterns, recognizing the predictable distortions of gossip and assumption. The office became a stage, and I was both observer and actor, careful to control my own movements and expressions while allowing the world to reveal itself around me. Messages arrived on my phone, notifications from social media, texts from mutual friends. and brief inquiries from colleagues who were unsure what to believe. I read each one carefully, assessing the source, the tone, the potential for interference or manipulation. I made no immediate replies, no emotional reactions. I documented every message, every indirect attempt at influence, preserving the sequence and context. Each entry reinforced the pattern. External pressure could rise, but it could not dictate my actions or compromise the clarity of my decisions. The day continued with an almost ritualized attention to observation. I tracked Emily's efforts to insert herself into my space, each attempt a signal of her expectation for me to respond or be affected. I acknowledged the rising tension in the air, the subtle currents of judgment and assumption from peers, and consciously separated it from my own intentions. My focus shifted to practical planning, reviewing available housing options, researching new work possibilities, and mapping social interactions that supported my recovery. I identified relationships that were stabilizing, reliable, and trustworthy, while gradually minimizing contact with those who contributed to confusion or stress. I moved through the office with measured steps, noting details that previously might have gone unnoticed. The cadence of footsteps in the hall, the timing of elevator doors, the way colleagues exchanged glances. Each observation was cataloged without bias, a record of social dynamics rather than a source of agitation. Even as whispers and questions followed me, I maintained an internal calm. The center of my awareness focused on the tangible, the verifiable, the controlled. By evening, the first layer of my new space had begun to take shape. Plans for apartments, for daily routines, and for professional engagements were no longer abstract. They were mapped, considered, and ready for execution. The social pressure continued, a background hum, but it no longer dictated my state. I had established a pattern of observation, documentation, and deliberate choice. The external chaos existed, but it no longer penetrated my interior landscape. In that quiet persistence, I began to feel the solid foundation of self-determination, the first real steps toward autonomy and recovery from the intrusion of another's manipulations. The news came quietly, through a chain of emails and muted office conversations. Emily and Michael had violated company policy, their actions reviewed and deemed unacceptable. Both were dismissed, removed from their positions, leaving a void in the structure of the office but, more importantly, confirming the correctness of my own decisions. I felt a subtle, almost imperceptible weight lift from my chest, a quiet validation that the boundaries I had asserted were not only justified but necessary. There was no celebration, no triumph, only the stark, clear acknowledgement that the consequences of their actions unfolded independently of me. I began the process of relocating, finding a small studio apartment that required patience and planning. Every step was deliberate, measuring the space, considering the placement of furniture, selecting practical appliances, and organizing documents and personal items. Each object that entered the space was positioned with intention, a tactile assertion of control over the environment. I arranged the bed, the kitchen area, and the modest workstation, aligning each piece according to need and comfort. Even the smallest details, a lamp angled for optimal light, a chair pulled just so, were part of establishing a rhythm and structure in the room that reflected my priorities and autonomy. The dismissal of Emily and Michael was a distant, almost abstract reality, a series of updates and confirmations that I monitored without involvement. I observed the cascading effects, their absence from the office, the realignment of projects, the quiet murmurs among colleagues. Their mistakes became lessons, examples of choices fully revealed and consequences fully realized. I recorded them in my mind with clarity, not for vindication, but as a concrete map of cause and effect, a reminder that autonomy and moral clarity did not require interference in the lives of others. Each day in the new apartment reinforced a sense of control. I established routines, unpacking, organizing, preparing meals, and methodically arranging work and leisure spaces. I reviewed my boundaries, mentally delineating what was acceptable and what was not as a reaction to others, but as a proactive framework for my own life. The quiet stability, the unbroken sequence of deliberate actions became grounding. Slowly, a sense of autonomy emerged, subtle at first, then more pronounced. I felt the weight of decision-making settle into a steady rhythm. This was my life, shaped by my choices, insulated from the chaos and misconduct of others. The office rumors, the social noise, the echoes of betrayal. They existed on the periphery, but they no longer penetrated my inner landscape. In the stillness of my apartment, with every detail arranged and accounted for, I experienced the first true recognition of control, the reassurance that I could navigate consequences, rebuild space, and maintain integrity without being drawn into the turbulence created by someone else's errors. A month had passed, and the routines of my new life had begun to settle into a steady rhythm. The studio apartment had taken shape, each piece of furniture, each appliance, and each corner arranged with intention. I found satisfaction in the small victories. A lamp angled perfectly for reading, a desk cleared of clutter, the kitchen organized so that preparing meals required minimal thought and effort. The space felt like mine, a reflection of control and order after the turbulence of the previous weeks. I noticed the subtle comfort in having everything within reach, everything accounted for, and every action deliberate. Work became a grounding force. I joined a local design firm, the environment professional yet unintrusive, filled with colleagues who operated within predictable, respectful patterns. I learned names, routines, and small gestures of camaraderie, recording them mentally as both social currency and a map of stability. Lisa, a colleague from accounting, emerged quietly as a presence I could trust. She offered small attentions, shared lunches, reminders about meetings, casual gestures that required nothing in return. Her consistency, her respect for boundaries, and the absence of hidden agendas created a space where trust could be rebuilt without fear of intrusion or manipulation. I structured my days deliberately. Mornings began with exercise, a mix of cardio and weight routines that set a tone of discipline and focus. I planned meals, prepping ingredients and cooking with attention to process rather than performance. Workdays were punctuated by brief walks, stretching breaks, and moments of observation, noting how colleagues interacted, how the office environment shifted, and how small acts of cooperation reinforced my sense of belonging. Evenings were reserved for reading, quiet reflection, and organization of personal projects, reinforcing the rhythm of autonomy and self-direction. The emotional residue of betrayal and humiliation faded gradually. I recalled the restaurant, the laughter, the gestures, and the indifference, but they no longer provoked rage or shame. Each memory was catalogued as data, evidence of a past decision whose correctness had been confirmed through consequences and self-consistent action. I reviewed them occasionally, not to dwell, but to reinforce clarity and moral certainty. The boundaries I had drawn were no longer fragile. They were a scaffold for my self-respect, a framework for consistent action and reflection. Confidence returned incrementally, manifested in posture, in the decisiveness of daily choices, and in the absence of hesitation when confronting small challenges. I noticed a calm in my decision-making, a certainty that came from observing cause and effect and acting with deliberate intent. The past no longer defined my emotional state. It existed as a series of lessons, a record of choices made and autonomy reclaimed. The clarity, the quiet moral equilibrium, and the routines of daily life became a stable platform, one from which I could approach both work and relationships with measured attention and confidence. In those weeks, the studio, the work, and the small gestures of kindness around me coalesced into a life that was functional, grounded, and resilient. The lingering shadows of betrayal existed only as reminders of limits enforced and lessons learned. I measured my progress in the routines I had established, the self-respect I maintained, and the growing sense that my decisions were sound, unshakable, and aligned with the values I had claimed through action. For the first time since the restaurant, I felt fully present in my life, not reacting to the echoes of others' mistakes, but shaping the present through intentional, deliberate engagement. 6 weeks had passed since the restaurant incident, and my life had begun to settle into a rhythm that was both deliberate and reassuring. The studio apartment had become a complete reflection of my choices. Furniture arranged for comfort and efficiency, appliances in place, documents filed, and personal items organized with care. Each morning I moved through the space with the quiet satisfaction of autonomy, noting how light fell across the room, how the air carried a subtle scent of order and familiarity. and how the structure of my environment mirrored the structure I had reclaimed in my mind. Emily attempted to reinsert herself into my life. She appeared at the door, messages followed, requests for help, attempts to explain, attempts to draw me into the consequences of her own mistakes. I observed without reaction, standing firm behind the boundaries I had established. Each attempt was recorded mentally, the sequence and tone noted, but none penetrated the calm I had cultivated. I closed the door quietly, returned to my routines, and reaffirmed the limits I had set. My focus remained on my life, on the space I was shaping, and on the deliberate choices that defined it. Work had stabilized. The design firm was familiar and predictable, my responsibilities clear, and the relationships steady. Lisa's presence was subtle but significant: shared lunches, mutual attention to detail, small gestures that demonstrated respect and equality. Our connection developed gradually, paced by mutual care and deliberate attention, devoid of pressure or expectation. Each interaction reinforced a sense of trust and reciprocity, a contrast to the imbalance and disregard of the past. I noted these moments as evidence of healthy, constructive relationships, internalizing the difference between respect and indulgence, care and performance. The external consequences of Emily's actions unfolded independently. News of her brief homelessness, difficulty finding employment, and the social repercussions of her behavior reached me indirectly. I observed these developments with quiet acknowledgement, recognizing them as the natural outcomes of her choices rather than as opportunities for involvement. There was no satisfaction in witnessing her struggles, only the clarity that her reality was now separate from mine. My emotional state remained intact, grounded in the principles I had reinforced: boundaries, autonomy, and self-respect. Each day reinforced internal control. I structured my time deliberately: morning routines of exercise and organization, work attended with focus and precision, evenings for reflection, cooking, and planning. The rhythms were deliberate and sustaining. My attention was directed toward what could be controlled and improved: my skills, my environment, my relationships built on reciprocity and respect. The past existed as a record of lessons learned, not as an emotional weight. I cataloged it, observed its consequences, and allowed it to remain outside my immediate sphere. By the end of the 6 weeks, I felt a profound sense of stability and moral clarity. My space, work, and developing relationships were aligned with my values. I had reclaimed autonomy, asserting my choices without interference from others' demands or manipulations. The world beyond my apartment continued to unfold, but I observed it from a position of calm and self-determination. I no longer participated in the chaos created by others, no longer absorbed the consequences of decisions that were not mine. The past was a fixed landscape, a reference point, but the present and future were mine to shape. In the quiet of my studio, with the routines I had established and the boundaries I maintained, I experienced the full measure of independence, clarity, dignity, and the freedom to construct a life defined entirely by deliberate choice.